You're not lazy. You're protecting something. And if you don't understand what that is, you will keep calling it lack of discipline while unconsciously avoiding the one thing that could expose who you really are. Because here's the contradiction most people never resolve. Some of the laziest people are not empty. They're ambitious. They want more than average people, more money, more freedom, more control. But instead of that ambition turning into action, it turns into hesitation. And that creates a question that doesn't go away. How can someone want so much and still do so little? At first, the answer seems simple. Discipline, consistency, stop procrastinating. But if it were that simple, you wouldn't still feel stuck, which means the problem is in effort. And this is where Friedrich Nietzsche becomes uncomfortable to understand, because he didn't see behavior as lack of motivation. He saw it as internal conflict. And once you look at it this way, something shifts. What if laziness is not the absence of ambition, but the result of ambition colliding with your identity? Now this opens the first psychological loop. Because if you want more but don't act, something is blocking the translation between desire and action. And the question becomes unavoidable. What could be stronger than your own ambition? Most people think it's effort, but it's not. It's exposure. Because the moment you act, you lose something that feels safe right now, your potential. As long as you haven't tried, your future is still intact. You can still believe you're capable. But the moment you act, reality answers back. And reality doesn't protect your self-image, it tests it. And this creates a second loop. Because if your identity is built around what you believe you could become, then action becomes a threat. Not to your goals, but to your self-image. So instead of moving, you hesitate, you wait, you prepare, because staying still keeps your potential untouched. And that illusion of safety becomes addictive. But that safety has a cost. And this is where the pattern tightens, because the longer you wait, the heavier your ambition becomes. It doesn't disappear, it accumulates. And when ambition accumulates without action, it turns into pressure. Now you're not just someone who wants more, you're someone who knows they're not doing anything about it. And this is where laziness changes form. It stops being avoidance and becomes protection. You're no longer avoiding work. You're protecting the idea that you could be more without risking discovering that you're not. And this creates a deeper loop, because the less you act, the further your goals feel. And the further they feel, the more overwhelming everything becomes, until even small actions start to feel meaningless. And from the outside, it looks like lack of discipline. But from the inside, it feels like pressure, confusion, and silent frustration. So you start explaining it. You say you're tired, you're waiting for the right moment, you work better under pressure. But underneath all of that, there's a tension you can't ignore. You are split between two identities, who you believe you should become and what your actions are proving right now. And Nietzsche would say this is not weakness, it's a divided will. One part of you wants growth, risk, expansion. Another wants safety, certainty, control. And when both are strong, they don't balance each other. They cancel each other. And that's paralysis. But this leads to a more uncomfortable question. Why does this happen more to intelligent, self-aware people? Why do those who see more often act less? It's easy to blame overthinking, but overthinking is just the surface. The real issue is deeper. It's how you relate to your own potential. Because for you, potential is not just possibility, it becomes identity. And once that happens, action becomes dangerous. Because now acting means risking the collapse of the version of yourself you believe in. And if your self-worth depends on that version, staying still feels safer than moving forward. This is the trap, not laziness, not lack of discipline, but the need to protect who you think you are. Which is why forcing yourself to work harder doesn't solve it. It increases the resistance, because you're fighting the symptom, not the structure behind it. So the real question is no longer, why am I lazy? The real question is much more uncomfortable. What part of you is benefiting from staying exactly where you are? Because until you see that, you're not stuck by accident, you're stuck on purpose. And in the next part, we're going to expose why your mind chooses potential over progress, even when you consciously want the opposite. If part of you is choosing to stay stuck, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly is it gaining from that? Because no behavior sustains itself without a payoff, even if that payoff is invisible, even if it's disguised as frustration, delay, or self-sabotage. And this is where the pattern becomes more unsettling, because the benefit is not external, it's psychological. It's internal stability. It's the ability to preserve a version of yourself that has not yet been tested by reality. And once you see that clearly, another layer opens. Because now you're not just dealing with laziness, you're dealing with a system designed to protect identity at all costs. And this is where most people make a critical mistake. They try to force action without understanding what that action threatens. They try to build discipline on top of resistance, and the result is predictable. Short bursts of motivation followed by collapse. Because the internal conflict was never resolved, it was only suppressed. And the more you suppress it, the stronger it comes back. Because now you're not just avoiding action, you're also carrying the weight of failure for not being consistent, which deepens the cycle even more. Because now every new attempt is not neutral. It's loaded with pressure, expectation, and the memory of past inaction. Now this creates another loop, and this one is even more subtle, because it disguises itself as intelligence. You start analyzing everything, planning everything, optimizing everything, but nothing actually moves. And the more you think, the more convincing your inaction becomes, because you can always justify waiting. You can always find a better strategy, a better timing, a better version of yourself to start with. And this creates the illusion of progress without the risk of exposure. But here's the uncomfortable part. If thinking feels like progress, then action starts to feel unnecessary. And when action feels unnecessary, stagnation becomes invisible. And this is why some of the most capable people stay stuck for years without realizing it. Because they are not passive, they are mentally active, constantly reflecting, constantly evaluating, constantly preparing. But preparation becomes a substitute for execution. And over time, that substitution becomes identity. You don't see yourself as someone who avoids action. You see yourself as someone who is getting ready. And that distinction is what keeps the cycle alive, because it removes urgency while preserving self-respect. But let's go deeper, because this still doesn't explain everything. If protection of identity is the goal, why does it feel so painful? Why does staying stuck create frustration, anxiety, and that constant sense that you're wasting your potential? If the mind is protecting you, shouldn't it feel safe instead of suffocating? This is where Nietzsche's perspective becomes sharper, because he didn't believe humans seek comfort above all else. He believed they seek coherence, a sense that their internal world aligns with their actions. And when that alignment breaks, tension appears, not as a mistake, but as a signal. And in your case, that signal is constant, because one part of you is expanding internally, imagining more, expecting more, while another part is contracting behaviorally, avoiding risk, avoiding exposure. And the gap between those two keeps growing. And the larger that gap becomes, the more pressure you feel. But here's the trap. Instead of closing the gap through action, you try to close it through interpretation. You change how you see the situation. You normalize delay. You redefine progress. You convince yourself that you're still on track, and this works temporarily. But reality doesn't adjust to your interpretation, and over time, the gap becomes impossible to ignore. Now you reach a critical point, because at this stage, most people split into two paths without realizing it. One path leads to gradual disengagement, where ambition slowly fades to reduce the tension. You lower your expectations. You become more realistic, more balanced. But what you're actually doing is shrinking your internal world to match your external behavior. The other path is more dangerous because you maintain your ambition, but detach it completely from action. You keep dreaming, keep imagining, keep expecting more from yourself, while doing nothing that would validate it. And this creates a silent form of self-rejection, because deep down, you know the gap is still there. And if you've made it this far, it probably means you recognize yourself somewhere in this pattern, not necessarily in every detail, but in the tension, in the feeling of wanting more while doing less than you know you're capable of. And that's exactly why this conversation matters, because awareness alone is not enough, but it's the first point where the cycle can start to break. So before we go deeper, pause for a moment and ask yourself honestly, where in your life are you choosing potential over progress right now? Drop it in the comments, because putting it into words forces clarity. And if this idea is already shifting how you see your own behavior, take a second to like the video and subscribe, not as a routine action, but as a signal that you're paying attention to something most people avoid. Because what comes next will only make sense if you stay with this tension instead of escaping it. Now let's go even deeper, because up to this point, it might still feel like you can fix this by just acting, by pushing through resistance, by forcing movement. But here's the problem. If the system is designed to protect identity, then forcing action without changing identity will always create friction, and friction eventually leads back to avoidance. So the real shift doesn't start with action. It starts with understanding what kind of identity requires protection in the first place. Because think about this carefully. If your sense of self depends on being someone with potential, then staying in potential is safe. But the moment you act, you transition from potential to reality. And reality is limited, measurable, imperfect. So by staying inactive, you preserve infinity. You preserve the idea that you could be anything, and that illusion is incredibly hard to let go of, especially for people who are used to thinking ahead, imagining possibilities, and defining themselves by what they could become instead of what they repeatedly do. And this is why the cycle is so persistent, because it's not built on weakness, it's built on attachment. Attachment to a version of yourself that hasn't been challenged yet. And the more you identify with that version, the more you resist anything that could contradict it, which means the real barrier is not effort, it's identity preservation. And once you see that, another question emerges, one that is even harder to ignore. If you are protecting this version of yourself so strongly, what would actually happen if you lost it? Because in the next part, we're going to confront exactly that. Not just the fear of failure, but the fear of becoming someone real instead of someone full of potential. And why that shift is the one thing most ambitious but lazy people never allow themselves to make. So now everything converges into a single point, because if you followed this far, you already see the pattern, and more importantly, you feel the tension. And that tension was never about laziness. It was about what you've been protecting this entire time. Because the real conflict was never effort versus discipline. It was illusion versus reality. The version of yourself that exists in your mind versus the one that appears when you act. And that is exactly where most people stop. Not because they can't move forward, but because moving forward would destroy something they've been holding on to for years. And this is the part most people avoid. Your potential is no longer empowering you. It's trapping you. Because as long as you define yourself by what you could become, you never have to confront what you actually are. And that creates a comfort that is hard to let go of, even when it's clearly limiting your life. Because that imagined version of yourself is perfect, untouched, infinite, and reality will always feel smaller in comparison. And that is why you hesitate, not because you lack discipline, but because action forces you into something real. So the shift is not a technique, it's a decision. You stop identifying with potential and start identifying with action. Because your life does not respond to who you think you are. It responds to what you repeatedly do. And this is where the fear finally becomes clear. You were never afraid of failure. You were afraid of limitation, of losing the infinite version of yourself and becoming something concrete, something measurable, something real. But here is the paradox that changes everything. The moment you accept that limitation, the moment you allow reality to replace imagination, you gain control. Because now you're not protecting an idea, you're building something that can actually grow. And this closes the loop. You were never lazy, you were divided. Divided between who you imagined yourself to be and what you were willing to prove. And that division is what created hesitation, overthinking, and delay. So now the question becomes unavoidable. What are you still protecting, and how much longer are you willing to protect it? Knowing that every day you delay, you're not preserving your potential, you're slowly losing it. Because at some point this stops being philosophy and becomes your life. And your life will always reflect what you do, not what you imagine. And if this made you stop and think, even for a moment, don't let that awareness disappear. Take a second to write in the comments what you've been avoiding. Because clarity begins when you make things visible. And if you want more content like this, subscribe and leave a like. Not as a habit, but as a decision to keep confronting what most people spend their lives avoiding. Because in the end, the question was never why you're lazy. It's whether you're ready to stop protecting who you think you are and finally face who you're willing to become.